The morning sun poured through the glass walls of Hawthorne Global's headquarters in downtown Chicago. Employees hurried through the revolving doors, coffee cups in hand, checking their phones as they rushed toward another demanding workday. The building was famous across the city. It represented success, power, and opportunity. But before any executive arrived, before the first meeting started, before the elevators filled with expensive suits, an elderly cleaning lady quietly pushed her worn janitor's cart across the polished marble floor. Her name was Margaret Ellis. She was 68 years old. Most employees barely noticed her. Some smiled politely. Most simply walked past as if she were invisible. Every morning, Margaret arrived at exactly 5:15 a.m., cleaned every hallway, emptied every trash can, polished every conference room, and disappeared before most people even realized she had been there. She never complained. She never asked for attention. She simply smiled. Hidden inside her old pocket was a faded photograph of a young girl wearing a blue dress. Whenever nobody was watching, Margaret gently looked at that picture and whispered, "One more day. I'm doing this for you." No one knew what those words meant. No one ever asked. Across the city, another morning had begun very differently. Inside the back seat of a black luxury SUV sat Daniel Hawthorne, the 43-year-old CEO of Hawthorne Global. Business magazines called him a genius. Investors admired him. Employees feared him. Daniel believed success belonged only to people who worked harder than everyone else. He judged people quickly. Their clothes, their jobs, their appearance, their confidence. To him, first impressions were everything. As his SUV stopped outside the company entrance, security guards immediately opened the doors. Employees straightened their posture. Managers nervously checked their ties. Everyone knew the CEO had arrived. Daniel walked into the lobby without greeting anyone. His expensive shoes echoed across the marble floor. At that exact moment, Margaret was mopping near the entrance. The floor was still wet. Without looking down, Daniel stepped forward. His polished shoe slipped slightly, only for a second, but it was enough to ruin his mood. He glared at Margaret. "Seriously," he snapped loudly. "Can't you clean after people arrive? Do you have any idea how dangerous this is?" The lobby fell completely silent. Everyone stopped walking. Margaret immediately lowered her head. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said softly. "The sign is right there. I didn't think anyone would." Daniel interrupted her. "Excuses." He looked at the yellow warning sign only a few feet away, then looked back at her. "If you're going to do a simple job, at least do it properly." Several employees looked away. A few felt embarrassed. But nobody dared speak. Margaret quietly nodded. "I'm sorry." Daniel walked away without another word. To him, it was already forgotten. To everyone else, it was just another ordinary morning. But one young intern standing near the reception desk couldn't forget what he had seen. His name was Ethan Brooks. And something about Margaret's calm smile after being humiliated didn't make sense. He had a feeling. There was a story nobody knew. And that story was about to change everything. Ethan Brooks couldn't focus for the rest of the morning. The scene in the lobby kept replaying in his mind. Margaret hadn't argued. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't even looked angry. Instead, she had quietly picked up the mop, smiled gently, and continued cleaning as if nothing had happened. It didn't make sense. Most people would have been humiliated. Most people would have gone home in tears. But not Margaret. During his lunch break, Ethan noticed her sitting alone on a small bench behind the building. She was eating a simple peanut butter sandwich from a paper bag, while reading an old notebook whose pages had turned yellow with age. Curious, Ethan walked over. "Mind if I sit here?" Margaret looked up with a warm smile. "Of course not." He sat beside her. "I'm Ethan. I just started here 2 weeks ago." "I know," Margaret replied kindly. "You always thank the security guards before coming inside. Not many people do that." Ethan smiled awkwardly. "You noticed?" "I notice everyone." There was something comforting about her voice. It reminded Ethan of his grandmother. After a moment of silence, he finally asked the question that had been bothering him all morning. "Why didn't you say anything to Mr. Hawthorne?" Margaret folded her sandwich wrapper carefully before answering. Because sometimes people speak from the pain they're carrying, not from the truth. Ethan frowned. But he embarrassed you in front of everyone. Margaret simply smiled. If someone throws anger at you, you don't have to catch it. Those words stayed with Ethan. Before he could ask another question, Margaret carefully closed the old notebook. For just a second, Ethan noticed a newspaper clipping tucked inside. It showed a younger Margaret standing beside a smiling man in a tuxedo outside a large building, but he could clearly read 3 words. Ellis Foundation opens. Before he could look closer, Margaret slipped the clipping back inside. I'm afraid my lunch break is over. She stood, picked up her cleaning cart, and slowly walked back into the building. Ethan watched her disappear down the hallway. Something wasn't right. Why would a cleaning lady have an old newspaper article about a foundation opening? And why did she seem completely different from how everyone treated her? Later that afternoon, Daniel Hawthorne sat in the executive boardroom with several investors. The meeting was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Everything had to be perfect. As Daniel prepared to begin his presentation, the projector suddenly shut off. The screen went black. The room became silent. His assistant tried everything. Nothing worked. Growing impatient, Daniel raised his voice. What is taking so long? An IT technician hurried into the room and quickly fixed the problem. Within minutes, the presentation continued. But Daniel's frustration had only grown. As the meeting ended, he walked into the hallway. There he saw Margaret quietly wiping fingerprints from the glass doors. Without even slowing down, Daniel muttered, I hope you do your job better than everyone else around here. Margaret looked at him with the same calm expression. I hope your day gets better, sir. Daniel didn't answer. He simply walked away. From the hallway, Ethan witnessed the entire exchange. This time he made a decision. He was going to find out who Margaret Ellis really was. Because deep inside, he was beginning to believe that the quiet cleaning lady everyone ignored was hiding a past no one in the building could even imagine. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office nearly an hour earlier than usual. The lobby was almost empty. Only the soft sound of a mop moving across the marble floor echoed through the building. Margaret was already working. She greeted him with the same gentle smile. Good morning, Ethan. Good morning, Margaret. He hesitated for a moment before asking, would you like a cup of coffee? My treat. Margaret laughed softly. I'd love that. A few minutes later, they sat together in the quiet employee cafe. There were no executives. No meetings. No rushing footsteps. Just 2 people sharing a peaceful conversation. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the old newspaper clipping. He wanted to ask about it, but he didn't want to seem rude. Instead he asked, have you always lived in Chicago? Margaret looked out the window. No. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. Life was simple back then. What brought you here? She smiled. Life has a funny way of changing our plans. Before Ethan could ask another question, her phone buzzed. It was an old flip phone, the kind almost nobody used anymore. She looked at the screen and her expression softened. I have to make an important call. She quietly walked outside. Ethan stayed behind. As he reached for his coffee, he noticed the yellow notebook Margaret had accidentally left on the table. He had no intention of opening it. But when he picked it up to return it, a folded paper slipped onto the floor. It wasn't just any paper. It was an old newspaper article. The photograph showed a much younger Margaret standing beside a man cutting a ribbon in front of a beautiful children's hospital. This time, the headline was completely visible. Ellis family donates $200 million to build Children's Medical Center. Ethan froze. $200 million? He read the article again. The Ellis family had once been among the wealthiest and most respected families in Illinois. Their donations had built hospitals, schools, and scholarship programs across the state. Margaret Ellis, the quiet cleaning lady, had once belonged to one of the richest families in America. His heart raced. Just then Margaret walked back inside. She saw the newspaper clipping in Ethan's hands. For a brief moment, sadness filled her eyes. Then she gently took the paper back and folded it carefully. I'm sorry, Ethan said quickly. I wasn't trying to read it. Margaret smiled. I know. There was no anger in her voice. Only kindness. Ethan looked at her in disbelief. If this is true, why are you working here as a cleaner? Margaret remained silent for several seconds. Then she whispered, because money can disappear much faster than love. Before she could explain further, someone called her name over the building radio. Margaret, could you please come to conference room B? She excused herself and walked away. Ethan sat there, completely speechless. The woman everyone ignored. The woman the CEO had insulted. Had once donated hundreds of millions of dollars to help strangers. At that very moment, on the top floor, Daniel Hawthorne received unexpected news. His chief financial officer rushed into the office. Daniel, we have a serious problem. Daniel looked up. What happened? The board has scheduled an emergency meeting. Why? The CFO took a deep breath. Someone has quietly purchased a large percentage of our company's shares. Daniel frowned. Ooh. The CFO slowly placed a confidential file on the desk. The buyer's identity is still hidden. But whoever it is now has enough voting power to change the future of Hawthorne Global. Daniel's confident smile slowly disappeared. For the first time in years, Daniel Hawthorne stared silently at the confidential file lying on his desk. For years, he had controlled every major decision at Hawthorne Global. No one challenged him. No one questioned his authority. But today was different. Someone had quietly purchased a significant portion of the company's shares without attracting attention. And no one knew why. Find out who it is, Daniel ordered. I don't care how long it takes. The company's legal team, financial advisors, and senior executives immediately began searching for answers. Yet every trail seemed to end at a network of private investment firms. The real buyer remained hidden. Meanwhile, Margaret quietly continued her work as though nothing unusual had happened. She cleaned offices. She greeted employees with a smile. She wished everyone a wonderful day. Not once did she mention the newspaper article Ethan had discovered. Later that afternoon, Ethan found Margaret organizing books in the small employee library. He walked over carefully. I've been thinking about what you said. Margaret smiled. About money? Ethan nodded. You said money disappears faster than love. Margaret looked at an old family photograph tucked inside her notebook. My husband believed that wealth should change lives, not lifestyles. She gently traced the edge of the picture with her finger. We spent years building hospitals, funding scholarships, and helping families we'd never even met. What happened? Ethan asked quietly. Margaret took a slow breath. We trusted the wrong people. She explained that after her husband passed away, several business partners convinced the family to invest in risky international projects. Within a few years, most of their fortune was gone. The foundation closed. Their companies were sold. Friends disappeared. Even relatives stopped calling. Only the memories remained. Ethan listened without interrupting. Then he asked the question that had been on his mind all day. If you once had everything, why work here? Margaret's answer came without hesitation. Because honest work gives a person something money never can. Dignity. Those single words stayed with Ethan long after she returned to work. That evening, the company's board gathered for the emergency meeting. Daniel entered the boardroom expecting to regain control. Instead, he found the directors unusually quiet. The chairman stood. We've received official confirmation. Daniel leaned forward. The new shareholder has requested to attend next week's board meeting. Who is it? The chairman slowly shook his head. They're represented through attorneys. Their identity will remain confidential until the meeting. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had spent years becoming the most powerful person in the company. Now someone he had never even met was about to walk into his boardroom with enough influence to change everything. As the meeting ended, Daniel stepped into the elevator. The doors opened in the lobby. Margaret was quietly replacing fresh flowers near the reception desk. For the first time, Daniel actually looked at her. She smiled politely. Good evening, Mr. Hawthorne. He gave a brief nod and walked away. Neither of them knew that in just a few days, they would meet again under circumstances that would leave the entire boardroom speechless. And Daniel Hawthorne would finally discover that the woman he had treated as invisible carried a past far greater than anyone could have imagined. The following Monday, Hawthorne Global buzzed with nervous anticipation. The emergency board meeting had become the only topic anyone could talk about. Rumors spread through every department. Some believed a powerful investment firm was preparing to take over the company. Others whispered that a billionaire from New York had secretly bought the shares. No one knew the truth. At exactly 9 a.m., black luxury cars began arriving outside the headquarters. Lawyers stepped out. Financial advisors followed. Security tightened throughout the building. Inside the executive boardroom, Daniel Hawthorne sat at the head of the long table, trying to hide the tension on his face. He had spent the entire weekend preparing for this meeting. Whoever the new shareholder was, Daniel intended to prove that he deserved to remain in control. Downstairs, Margaret quietly polished the brass handrail near the lobby. Her work was almost finished. Just then, a well-dressed woman in a navy suit entered the building carrying a leather briefcase. She walked directly toward Margaret. Without saying a word, she smiled warmly. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Ellis." Margaret returned the smile. "It's been a long time." Ethan happened to witness the exchange. He immediately recognized the visitor. She was one of Chicago's most respected corporate attorneys. The attorney handed Margaret a sealed envelope. "Everything is ready. They're waiting for you upstairs." Margaret looked at the envelope for a few seconds before quietly nodding. "Thank you." Ethan's heart pounded. Waiting for her? Upstairs? In the boardroom? A few minutes later, every director had taken their seat. The chairman stood and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, our newest shareholder has arrived." The boardroom doors slowly opened. Daniel looked toward the entrance, expecting to see a famous billionaire. Instead, he froze. Every executive around the table stared in complete disbelief. Walking calmly into the room was Margaret Ellis, still wearing the same simple shoes, still carrying the same worn notebook. The room fell silent. Daniel stood up so quickly that his chair slid backward. "You." His voice barely came out. This has to be some kind of mistake." The attorney stepped forward. "There is no mistake." She placed several official documents on the conference table. "Mrs. Margaret Ellis is the legal trustee of the Ellis Family Legacy Trust." She continued. "Over the past several months, the trust has legally acquired a significant ownership stake in Hawthorne Global." Every director immediately began reviewing the documents. Everything was authentic. Everything was legal. Daniel couldn't believe what he was seeing. He looked at Margaret, searching for an explanation. She calmly met his eyes. There was no anger, no pride, no desire for revenge. Only quiet dignity. "I never came here looking for power," Margaret said softly. "I came looking for purpose." The room remained silent. Then she added words that left everyone speechless. "My late husband helped finance the original expansion of this company over 30 years ago. We believed Hawthorne Global could improve people's lives." She looked around the room. But somewhere along the way, people became less important than profits. Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time in many years, he couldn't find a single word to say. And deep inside, he realized the greatest lesson of his life was only beginning. The boardroom remained completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Every executive looked from Margaret to Daniel, waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel Hawthorne slowly sat back down. For the first time in his career, he felt something he had spent years avoiding. Shame. He remembered the morning in the lobby. The sharp words. The impatient tone. The way he had dismissed Margaret without knowing a single thing about her life. Now, standing before him was not just the company's newest major shareholder. She was a woman whose family had once helped build the very future he had inherited. After a long silence, Daniel finally stood. He looked directly at Margaret. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "Mrs. Ellis, I owe you an apology." The room became even quieter. "I judged you by your uniform. I assumed your job defined your worth. I was wrong. I've spent years believing leadership was about authority. But today you've reminded me that real leadership begins with respect. Margaret smiled gently. Thank you, Daniel. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. Daniel lowered his head. I hope you'll forgive me. Margaret walked toward him. I forgave you the moment it happened. Several people around the table wiped tears from their eyes. But Margaret wasn't finished. She opened her worn notebook and removed a single sheet of paper. I didn't buy shares to control this company. I bought them to protect what it was always meant to become. She handed the proposal to the chairman. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, "The Ellis Opportunity Initiative." The plan would create scholarships for employees' children, emergency financial assistance for workers facing hardship, paid education programs, and a fund to help long-serving staff retire with dignity. Everyone would finally receive the recognition they deserved. The directors read the proposal in silence. One by one they nodded. Then the chairman smiled. I'd like to call for a vote. Every hand in the room was raised. The proposal passed unanimously. A few weeks later, Hawthorne Global felt like a different company. Employees greeted one another by name. Managers spent more time listening than ordering. The new scholarship program helped dozens of families. Several longtime workers who had quietly struggled for years finally received the support they needed. Daniel changed too. Every morning, before entering his office, he walked through the lobby. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to personally thank every employee who helped keep the company running. One morning, he found Margaret watering the flowers near the entrance. He smiled warmly. Good morning, Margaret. She smiled back. Good morning, Daniel. You know, he said, this lobby looks better every day. Margaret laughed softly. It always did. We just finally started noticing. Months later, Margaret quietly retired. There was no small gathering. No fergaten forguel. The entire company filled the auditorium. Executives stood beside janitors. Receptionists sat beside board members. Security guards, interns, accountants, and managers applauded together as Margaret walked onto the stage. Daniel handed her a small wooden box. Inside was the original nameplate from the very first Hawthorne Global office, carefully restored. Engraved beneath it were the words, "Character is revealed not by what we achieve, but by how we treat people who can do nothing for us." Margaret held back tears. This, she whispered, is worth more than any fortune I ever had. As she left the stage, every person in the room rose to their feet. The applause lasted for several minutes. Not because she had been wealthy. Not because she owned part of the company. But because she had reminded everyone of something success alone could never teach. Every person deserves dignity. Every act of kindness matters. And sometimes, the most extraordinary people are the ones the world almost forgets to notice.